I'm here to talk about nonprofit financial performance, and I'm competing with the smell of pizza. So that's going to be interesting. And I know that nonprofit financial performance may not sound fascinating or as relevant to young people as some of the other topics that we've covered in the past couple of days. It does have life or death consequences for the young people who access the services that we provide, and I think it's important to elevate it. My name is Kate Bacalao. I'm the Director of Public Funding at Larkin Street Youth Services in San Francisco, so I manage our public contracts and I work pretty closely with federal, state, and local funders. And so I have experience with sort of a breadth of public funding streams that support shelter and residential programs, rental subsidy programs, wellness programs, and education and employment programs. And I wanted to present this in the format that I wrote it. It's an article that came out in October in the Nonprofit Quarterly, and I set out to ask a question I already knew the answer to, which is how easy is it for a line item in a public budget to become an essential service for a young person who needs services? And because I already know the answer, I'll tell you it is not easy at all. And I'm here to talk about why and what some of the implications are. So before federal and state budget line items can become services, they have to become line items in nonprofit budgets. And public funders dictate down to nickels and dimes how that money is spent. There's strict upper limits on how much funders will pay for staff in a shelter facility, for example. And regulations may also stipulate that a nonprofit can, for example, invoice for towels, but not bath mats, or that breakfast for youth is capped at $2.50 per participant, which wouldn't have bought me a Starbucks latte on my way over here this morning. So I think the human element is the most important. It's a failure of public priorities that we're being so prescriptive about what young people are eating for breakfast or lunch or how they're accessing services in a shelter, one. And then two, it is a failure of public priorities that regulations can be so burdensome and they come with only partial payment. The Alliance for Strong Families and Communities published a pretty groundbreaking report earlier this year in January. They got together with Oliver Wyman, a management consulting firm, and Sea Change Capital Partners, which is a big nonprofit bank, and they reviewed 200,000 990, Forms 990, which are the tax filings that your agency does every year with the IRS. And those tax filings represented like multi-year reports from over 40,000 community-based organizations. So not just youth providers or homeless services providers, but the whole industry, which is responsible for some $200 billion in spending every year in revenue and services. So it's a really big industry, and it's like 3 million employees nationwide. And they found some pretty terrible, enlightening things. So they found that government contracts pay on average about 70 cents on the dollar for direct program services. And then for indirect services, the overhead, basically the agency systems that support the program, so maybe your agency data and evaluation system or your finance department or those kinds of administrative systems, government contracts pay only 50 cents on the dollar for those. And as a result, it's not exactly surprising to see that nearly 1 in 8 nonprofits are insolvent or unable to pay their debts, that 3 in 10 lack the cash to meet basically a month's worth of expenses in advance, and that nearly half of them report a negative operating margin, which is a fancy way of saying that they are losing money over multiple operating years. So they're not breaking even, they are losing money. And that's all reflected in the nonprofit financial statements that your boards get, and then your boards probably call up your executive directors and say, hey, what the heck is going on? And what I wanted to talk about is that what's going on is not just what's going on at the agency, it's what's going on sector-wide. It's about how well nonprofits are allowed to operate by the budgetary ecosystem in which they find themselves. Boards don't always realize that. Executives don't always realize that. This report came out in January, and I think that there probably was enough data to infer some sector-wide trends before the report was issued, but the report goes a long way towards proving what we couldn't prove before. So it's really important. And I think that the key takeaway is that there is a causal link between a financial performance of a nonprofit and the budgetary ecosystem in which it's operating. Government budgets have grown this ecosystem with artificially low investment levels and overly burdensome regulations that determine what's considered market across the sector. So we could spend $500,000 for a statue in a public park, and that's in one context, and that's what a statue costs. And then in another context, if you bring that into a youth shelter, suddenly that becomes so much money. And I think that's crazy. A dollar is a dollar, and especially when we're saving lives, it's even more so, especially a dollar. So central to a nonprofit's ability to maintain long-term financial health is its ability to reinvest in delivering impact. And so that means that the nonprofit has to generate a surplus. And nonprofits, a surplus is a way of saying that, it's basically extra cash that's, left over at the end of the operating year for unexpected, like unbudgeted needs. A lot of the money that would have been surplus goes to that gap between what contracts pay and what programs cost. And so money that we could spend to be reinvesting in our services and building a really healthy infrastructure where we're producing, where we're saving lives, producing better life outcomes, partnering with everybody in that work. Instead, we're plugging gaps, and we're losing opportunities to invest in our strategic priorities. And there's something really, really profoundly messed up about that. So I wanted to elevate that. And I also wanted to say that nonprofits are designed, they're called nonprofits. We're not supposed to generate surplus. And we're measured on our utilization rates. And so if we don't fully spend that money, the government funders deobligate the funds at the end of the operating year, they take them back. So we are structurally set up not to be able to reinvest. And it's a very reasonable conclusion that we're supposed to make our services available, but not in any viable way over time. And so I'll finish real quick with what I think we should do to fix the problem. I think, one, we have to address artificially low investment levels. Public funders have to put real money on the table. And then it's also incumbent on us to negotiate for what we need, for them to pay our full costs, not just the program costs, but the proportionate share of agency level costs that are required to operate the program and make sure that it's really doing what it's supposed to be doing and delivering the impact over time. Are we just providing beds, or are we using our youth shelter to help young people end their homelessness? Two, we need to address overregulation. We should be complying with the major rules of the road, GAP, and all of that. But when it comes to all the little I's that we dot and all the little T's that we cross, those all need to further the end game of addressing youth homelessness meaningfully, ending it. And to the extent that they're not doing that, and to the extent that compliance is no longer cost effective, we've got to review and revisit those regulations. And then finally, I think getting the word out is important. Nonprofits can act individually and collaboratively to talk in a different way about their financial performance and emphasize that key distinction between how well we're operating our youth shelters and other programs and how well they're allowed to operate in the context in which they find themselves financially and in a regulatory way. Any questions? Yeah, the report is linked in the article, and it's called A National Imperative, Strengthening Human Services. That should pull it up on Google. It's a long name. Yeah, so it's nearly half are basically losing money they have a negative operating margin over 3 years. 1 in 8 are insolvent, technically, and then 3 in 10 don't have operating cash. And it's even worse, actually, for housing and shelter providers. The numbers are worse, and the report provides that data. Yeah, I think so. I think boards get nonprofit financial statements and they think, "Hey, what's going on here?" And they don't realize there's sector-wide trends in play. Everybody is seeing a specific piece of the elephant, as it were. And so, just as it's important not to pathologize individuals and recognize that there are structural causes that are underneath and behind and around all of these things, it's the same for the finances. And I think too often we think about the sector as being separated between the folks on the programs doing the really critical life-saving work, and then the folks in the admin who are supporting it. And it's like the work is all connected to the work, I think. And I'm not saying that one role is, I think probably providing the services is really essential. So I don't want to say that, but I do think that there's a false separation between the admin and the programs, because the admin feeds the programs, and if we don't have the robust admin, then the programs aren't getting what they need to operate, and it perpetuates a vicious cycle in which we're not given enough to perform, and then we're underperforming, and then that justifies continued underinvestment, and that's it's an enormous problem on a massive scale. Actually, the report estimates that nationwide CBOs are like 40 billion in the red because of this. So it would be a massive undertaking to set it right. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think a lot of this is rooted in miscommunication and lack of trust, and also this nonprofit starvation cycle, which is what it's called in the literature, where funders assume, okay, 10% indirect is totally enough to service all your programs, that's fine, and then nonprofits say, okay, and then they underreport their costs, and there's this collective pressure not to say, okay, hey, we're on fire over here. No one wants to say that, and so I think saying that under the umbrella of a coalition that's not any one agency can be important. Referring to studies like this, like sending them to your board, sending them to people who can think in a different way about this stuff is really important, and start sort of creating an environment where people feel a little bit more comfortable talking about that stuff is key.